Good morning and welcome to Member Focus Monday. I'm Christina Schaefer, Director of Social Media for HAR, and I'm very happy this morning that it's not too rainy outside. It's looking pretty good, and we have Eric Berger with Space City Weather joining us today. Welcome back to the program, Eric.
Good morning, Christina. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I say that because we were supposed to do this 2 weeks ago, but this was delayed a little bit. If you want to maybe tell us why.
Well, that was just about when Hurricane Beryl was trucking on through Houston. And I, like a lot of people, had lost power and internet. So it would have been difficult to pull off the live stream at that time. And I'm not sure how many people would have been watching anyway.
Yeah, we made the good decision to postpone the day before, but as you said, yeah, we were all without power, so I don't know how many people would have been watching anyway, but I'm so happy that you're here to join us today. Of course, there's always stuff going on with Houston weather, so we have some things to talk about, and also some lessons learned post-Beryl, which I would love to hear from you, as well as what you think about the remainder of hurricane season. Before we get into all of that, though, Eric, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about Space City Weather, who you are, and what you do.
Yeah, I'm a longtime journalist. I worked at the Houston Chronicle for about 15 years, writing about science. I got really interested in weather around the time of Hurricane Katrina and Rita in 2005. Became a certified meteorologist after that. I left the Chronicle in 2015 to write about space for a website called Ars Technica, and started Space City Weather as a hobby since I had had a following at the Chronicle, and it the site really blew up after Hurricane Harvey in 2017, and so since then we that's primarily me and Matt Lanza have tried to provide accurate or as accurate as possible weather information for the greater Houston area, kind of with a calm approach. We call it no hype, trying to tell people what they need to know, kind of without the extraneous fluff, I guess you might say.
Yeah, and I think that's. I mean, I know for myself, I'm a I'm a follower of Space City Weather. Have your app on my phone, which you can tell us about later. But I know that for me, somebody who lives in Galveston County, we get all these threats and warnings and watches and all of that stuff. But it's nice to see the calm approach. Without the headlines, I guess you could say. So thank you so much for joining us today. Let's dive right in. So Hurricane Beryl, of course, it was 2 weeks ago today. I know there's been a lot of news post storm and kind of reflections on it. What lessons do you feel we can all learn from Hurricane Beryl as we go through the remainder of this year's hurricane season?
Yeah, the biggest lesson that I took away from Beryl is that our region's electricity transmission system is a lot more fragile than really I thought. We had a pretty good test of it 15 years ago, almost with Hurricane Ike. That was in 2008, and that knocked off power to 80 to 90% of people in the Houston area. That was a Category 2 hurricane, and Beryl's winds were significant, but they were definitely less than most the region saw during Ike, and yet the power outages were comparable, maybe a little bit less in duration. And quite frankly, a Category 1, making landfall 80 or 90 miles south of Houston, even though its track ultimately does go right through the city, probably should not knock out power to everyone. And so I think going forward, we're going to be much more sensitive to that issue. Obviously, electricity has been a major issue since the winter storm of 2021, when it was a different aspect. It was the availability of power rather than the ability to get it to your home that caused problems. But now it's pretty clear that we're going to have to watch for power distribution as well, as a major issue going forward, and that's a center point problem. They're not the only distributor, but they're the main distributor in Houston. So our readers are obviously much more sensitive about that, and we're going to be watching it that closely.
Post storm, I saw in my news feed quite a bit. I'm sure you saw as well comments that were coming through saying, and this was just a Category 1, or even leading up to the storm, it's just a Category 1. Do you have any thoughts on that rhetoric that we kept seeing and hearing?
Yeah, I mean, it was, quote, just a Category 1, but I do think there were some factors that made it worse for Houston. One was that it was starting to strengthen quite a bit just as it was coming on shore, on that Sunday night, Monday morning. it looked like it was in the process of about beginning to rapidly intensify. And so it had built up a lot of energy and momentum. And so as it moved northward fairly quickly, it took some time to unwind that momentum and really begin the weakening process. Um, so, on one hand, we were really fortunate that the storm didn't have another 12 hours over water because I think it could easily have been a Category 2 or even Category 3 hurricane as opposed to a Category 1. But due to that faster northward motion, it was able to get the Houston area, less than 12 hours after landfall. And so it was still a pretty robust hurricane with a wide area of damaging winds as it moved into the Houston area. And the fact that also is that its track really did bring its center and core of strongest winds to the right of the center across the most populated parts of the region.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that. And again, as we move through the hurricane season, I think just the knowledge of what this storm did will help us all maybe better prepare if we didn't feel as prepared as we should have been. Let's talk a little bit about the spaghetti models because we see these on all different news sources. Is there one model that's maybe more reliable than others?
Well, I would just say if people are looking for one thing to look at that's the most reliable, it really would be the National Hurricane Center forecast,
Mm-hmm.
which is 5 days out for a track. They look at everything and they're able to weigh sort of which models are more reliable than the others. So if you're just looking for one thing, that's it. Um, and it also depends on what models and what type of spaghetti plot you're looking at because some of them have like everything from a very basic statistical model like where have storms historically in this location gone um, down to highly high resolution very powerful global models.
Mm-hmm.
So it's you really got to know what you're looking at to kind of make sense. I mean, if all the models are like tightly clustered together, then you can be pretty confident that track is a good one. But oftentimes they're much more spread out. So you've got to understand, well, should I trust this model more than the other one?
Mm-hmm.
As a general rule, the two best the two best models to look at are the operational runs of the European model, sometimes called ECMWF, European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and the United States Global Forecast System, which is operated by NOAA and the National Weather Service. So it's the GFS and the European model generally are the most reliable. But there are many other, NOAA has some hurricane specific models, such as HWRF and some even newer ones that are worth looking at to look at the inner dynamics of the storm and potential strengthening. But generally, the GFS and the European model are the two most reliable to consider.
Great, thank you. Well, AI has made its way into every industry. It seems it's definitely impacted the real estate industry. How accurate have the AI models been so far that you've seen?
So it's interesting. Before Beryl, we had Tropical Storm Alberto. And, in looking at the performance of the AI models, I've not seen a rigorous study of this. So this is just my,
Mm-hmm.
as an operational observations as a meteorologist. I felt that the AI models did pretty poorly
Mm-hmm.
with Alberto in terms of its track. They did seem to do better with Beryl. Some of them picked up on the northern turn faster than the traditional model. So AI models don't use any physics, right? They basically train an AI system through deep learning to look at, you know, the current state of conditions today, and then over 6 years of meteorological data, sort of parse out what is likely to happen
Mm-hmm.
based upon what is observed. Um, Whereas the GFS, the European, a lot of the other models I referenced actually do try to model the physics of the atmosphere. So they're crunching through these complex equations to try to model the behavior of the atmosphere and then sort of run that forward in permutations to see what will happen. There's very different approaches. But there is some promising, this is really the first year we've been able to look at the artificial intelligence models in real time. So that story, we're really just at the beginning of that story, and it's too early to say anything definitive.
Okay. And what makes those turns? Some would say sudden turns, but what makes those turns in the storm? At one point, Beryl was tracking towards Mexico, and then it just kept seemingly coming more and more north towards Houston. What causes those turns when maybe we see a model pointing one way and all of a sudden it's going a different direction?
Yeah, it sure does feel like you can manifest that turn, right? Just by thinking,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's going to hit me, it's going to hit us. Eventually, it's going to turn. In reality, in this sense, what we were seeing is that there was a high pressure system over the southeastern United States, and tropical systems, generally move westward across the Atlantic and even the Gulf of Mexico until they find a weakness in the high. And then once they sort of get far enough north, and there's a weakness in the high, they turn poleward, basically toward the North Pole, and recurve. And so it's basically tracing a line around the edge of that high pressure system and turning north. And in this case, there was a pretty fine line between where that high was going to set up. And so it looked like it was going to get weaker, a little bit weaker, and a little bit weaker, and that just allowed for Beryl to turn, um, northward a little bit earlier than expected. And the other thing too is if you look at the Texas coast, it kind of comes down like this. Sorry, and so if a storm is sort of turning, it doesn't take a huge turn to have a storm line up that's tracking north. The distance in terms from east to west between Houston and Brownsville really isn't that far.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't take a huge change in turn to change the ultimate landfall location.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about the Saharan dust. How is that impacting the development of tropical systems?
Yeah, so since Beryl, things have been pretty quiet over
Mm-hmm.
the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico. Thankfully, we've had the mid-July lull. This is very typical for this time of year. July is often quite a quiet month, and in fact, Beryl was pretty historic in terms of how strong it got over the Caribbean and how early in the season. That's certainly an indication of the very, very warm sea surface temperatures out there. And so we've seen things quiet down since Beryl, and that is due in part to the Saharan dust, which is typically very active this time of year. This is basically winds blowing across sub-Saharan and Saharan Africa and picking up this dust and depositing it in the Atlantic. And sometimes we get it as far to the west in Houston, and we get prettier sunsets. But that Saharan dust has basically been out there helping to keep activity down. We've also seen a pattern of sinking air generally over the tropics rather than rising air, so that has really helped dampen activity. It does look like, by the beginning of August, both of those patterns will start to shift. We'll see less dust, and the air pattern will flip to more of a rising air. So I think we have probably another week or 10 days of quietude in the tropics, but unfortunately, as we get into August, I would expect activity to really start ramping back up.
Gotcha. Well, at least it's on our radar. No pun intended.
No.
So, speaking of, so I mentioned earlier we hear about warnings and watches. What is the difference between a warning or a watch, whether it be flood, hurricane, tornado? What is the difference? What are we looking at there?
So a watch is just essentially the National Weather Service saying the conditions today or tonight or for whatever period they're talking about are favorable for the development of tornadoes or heavy
Mm-hmm.
rain or what have you. Or if there's a storm surge watch or tropical storm watch along the coast, there could be a tropical storm coming to the coast. A warning is when in fact something is imminent. So it means that there is a tornado or there is a tropical storm coming and you need to be warned and prepared for it. So a watch is sort of a heads up that something could happen, and a warning is saying, hey, it's happening.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good to know. And that's usually, I know for me with a with a tornado, at least that's when my phone tells me take cover now.
Yeah, and it's
So
important. It's important though too with tornado warnings.
yeah.
It's a little more complicated
Mm-hmm.
because you can't always be definitively know from radar that there's a tornado. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes there's a very clear signature, but sometimes it looks like there's a tornado, but there may or may not be one, and it may or may not be touching all the way down to the surface. And so you have to confirm those with spotters on the ground. But since there's a delay in that, sometimes the National Weather Service will issue a tornado warning when they suspect there's a tornado.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some false positives with tornadoes. I don't say that because I don't think people should take them seriously. They absolutely should. You should take cover when there's a tornado warning, but
Mm-hmm.
just know that they're not always confirmed tornado signatures.
Good to know. Thank you so much. I have more questions for Eric, but if you have questions, please type them in, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. We've kind of already alluded to it, but we've seen reports this year that this could be a record hurricane season. What is your prediction? What do you anticipate for the rest of this hurricane season beyond this quiet time that you said for the next 10 days or so?
Yeah, I think we need to be take things very seriously. Typically August and September are the busy months for the Texas coast, including the Houston area, and I expect that to be no different this year. Although I do think the difference will be it will be busier than normal. And so we've already seen Alberto and Beryl in the Gulf of Mexico. That's two storms, and it's only, let me check, July 22nd. That's a little concerning. But people need to pay attention every year during the tropic season, especially in August and September. But this year, because we've seen these such anomalously warm sea surface temperatures, it's storms will have the potential to rapidly intensify and to get very, very strong.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't want anyone to be afraid. I would say something like this. So in any given year, the odds of the Houston area being directly impacted significantly by a hurricane is about 1 in 10. Now, we've already had that with Beryl. I would consider that a direct and significant impact. Um, that doesn't mean it can't happen again. And before this year, I would have said the odds are probably about 1 in 5 instead of 1 in 10. So just we're more likely to be impacted this year. And the fact that we've already had Beryl doesn't mean anything about what will happen in August and September. So people need to be on their guard. I always say be wary instead of worried. And then by the end of September, we'll probably get to the point where we can take a breath and say, the season is pretty much over for us.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to get to sort of middle or late September before making that kind of determination for this year.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, you mentioned the water temperatures, but on land we haven't hit 100 degrees so far this summer, although it feels like it. Is this normal and for this time of year, and what does that mean for the rest of summer?
Yeah, so June was a bit warmer than normal. July, the daytime temperatures have been cooler than normal. The nights have been warmer than normal, which is consistent with the background pattern of climate change that we've seen for a while. The nights are just getting warmer as the
Mm.
Gulf of Mexico gets warmer and the atmosphere changes a little bit. Daytime temperatures this month have been cooler, and that's because we've had lots of rainfall with Beryl and other systems. And this next week, this coming week, well, Monday and then the days ahead, we're going to again be in the 80s for the most part, which is about 10 to 15 degrees cooler than we were last year. And again, that's rain cooled air, it's cloudy skies. So I do end up thinking, I do think this month may actually be a little cooler than normal, again, due to all the rain we're having in July.
Mm.
Um, all bets are off, I think, for August. I think we're going to get right back to Houston summertime heat in the 90s and higher. Sure, would love to get through the summer without hitting 100 degrees, but I have no way of knowing whether that's going to happen.
Okay, very good. Well, we just mentioned, kind of a little bit of what to expect. Stay vigilant the rest of this hurricane season. What is your advice, though, for people who maybe they're watching the news and seeing all the predictions for this hurricane season and feeling stressed or maybe more so than usual, overly anxious about hurricane season? Some of these people who might still have PTSD from Harvey and now recent memories of Beryl. What is your advice for people who are maybe dealing with a lot of stress around the weather right now?
Yeah, it's a difficult time. I mean, it's especially with Beryl so fresh in our minds, people are going to have anxiety and be watching the tropics extra closely and be concerned about things. I would offer two pieces of advice. First of all, knowledge is power. Um, and if you, and the more you know about things, the less uncertainty, the less anxiety, I think. And so again, knowledge is power. And by that, I mean, understand where you live. If you live in Katy, Texas, you're not concerned about storm surge.
Mm-hmm.
If you live in an area with that's fairly built up, you're probably not that concerned about inland flooding. But if you live anywhere in Houston, wind is a threat. Now it's less of a threat in Katy or the Woodlands than it is in Galveston or areas closer to the coast. But as we saw with Beryl, depending on the track of a hurricane, high winds can be observed anywhere in the greater Houston metro area. So really, my advice is to know your vulnerabilities. How much at risk are you for inland flooding, for coastal storm surge, and for damaging winds? And then, and again, like with damaging winds, things like trees matter a lot. If they fall down on power lines, yes, but they also can fall into roofs, or branches can swing around and hit windows. And cause damage that way. And so, you know, know your vulnerabilities and then know how you will react, because every storm is different. Like Hurricane Ike in 2008 was primarily a storm surge event, massive storm surge. Wind was a secondary threat. Hurricane Harvey in 2017, there were no issues with wind, no issues with storm surge, but inland flooding was absolutely nightmarish. And with Beryl, some areas experienced tropical deluge rainfall and some flooding, but inland flooding really was an event. It was actually, a surge was kind of an issue for Galveston and places like that, but it was mostly a wind event, right, knocking out power to most people. Every hurricane is going to have different levels of threat with wind, surge, and inland flooding. And then so first understand your vulnerabilities, and then know how you're going to respond, right? So under what circumstances will you evacuate, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the storm is going to be, the winds are going to be greater than Beryl, and your power was out for a week, do you want to evacuate ahead of that? Do you have the means to do that? Or if not, how will you stock supplies? And if you live closer to the coast, I mean, the people who really need to evacuate during a hurricane are people subject to coastal storm surge flooding, because that water can come in quickly, and that causes the majority of fatalities during a hurricane. So understand your vulnerabilities and then have a plan for what you'll do in the eventuality that such a system threatens.
Very good. Thank you. And a perfect comment to follow up your remarks just now. Janine just said, Eric, thank you for Space City Weather. You are a calm voice in a sea of alarmist media. So we definitely appreciate that. And I know, again, as I said earlier, I follow what you guys post, especially when there's a storm in the Gulf, religiously. So, Eric, our realtor members work with some people who are looking to relocate to the Houston area. How would you describe our weather in Houston, not just during hurricane season, but generally to people who are looking to move here from out of state?
um, I mean, Houston's weather is challenging. The
Mm-hmm.
summer months are, for most people, are pretty unpleasant, with the temperatures and the humidity, and the vulnerability to tropical weather. But Houston's vulnerability to hurricanes is no different than anywhere from Brownsville all the way along the Gulf Coast, the state of Florida, even places like Georgia, on the Atlantic coast. Like, all of that entire area is very vulnerable to tropical storms and hurricanes. And so, you get the benefit of living near the water, and all of the activities that entails. But the downside is we are vulnerable to hurricanes and also moisture for tropical rainfall, heavy rainfall. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's summer is no fun in terms of the heat for a lot of people, and we're definitely vulnerable to severe weather. On the plus side, our falls, winters, and I think especially springs are really quite pleasant, very moderate compared to a lot of the rest of the country. We're not vulnerable to earthquakes at all. And while we do get tornadoes here, they're typically not the long track damaging tornadoes that you see in places like Oklahoma and Alabama. Um, so we have our share of natural disasters. Certainly not the most pleasant place to live in the summer, but there are some good things as well about the Houston summers, in the other seasons.
Very good. Thank you for that. And just a comment that came in from Tiffany: you speak the truth, and we still love Texas. So very good. Well, Eric, you've answered so much you've shared so much great information today. We really appreciate it. We have a couple more questions that are coming in, and if you have more questions for Eric, now is the time. I do see there's a question about your app that I'm going to get to in just a second. Before that, I want you to tell us a little bit about it and tell us how can we stay updated and follow Space City Weather anywhere.
Yeah, so I mean, our primary portal is our website, spacecityweather.com. But There are many other ways to follow us on all whatever social media account you prefer. A couple years ago, we launched an app which is entirely free. We don't do any tracking. And basically, primarily, you can get notifications for every time we post, but there's a lot more rich data in there from forecasting, 7-day forecasts, hourly forecasts, discussions from the National Weather Service, and more. So we've tried to put a lot of good information there for anyone who lives in the greater Houston area, um, without a lot of nonsense.
Very good. So your website, which we have linked in the comments that people can go follow, and the app that you can find in the App Store and Google Play Store.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Very
It's
good.
both iOS and Android.
Very good. The question that came in about the app was from Donna asking, will your app someday give a current location instead of only Houston? And then she just added, thank you for all you calmly do.
Yeah, so thank you, Donna. If you click on the location in the upper left hand corner, there are actually 14 different sites you can choose from. Places like League City or the Woodlands or Katy, or Baytown. Basically, wherever there's a good sensor to get current real time data, we have a location. So depending on where you are in the Houston area, you can find a good location that fits you. And we do that manually because we don't want to track people's movements and locations, or gather any data like that, and so that people can select that for themselves.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Well, Eric, again, you've shared some great information today. Is there anything else that you want to share with our audience?
I would just say this, Christina. We are entering what I would say the most challenging period of Houston's weather, and I realize that we just went through a Hurricane Beryl.
Mhm.
Hopefully, that was the worst of it this summer. But for me, always like August and the first few weeks of September are the roughest time of year. Our temperatures peak in very late July and August, um, and it's August. I got to be honest with you, it's pretty miserable between the heat and having to watch the tropics. In September, sort of the heat sometimes lingers, and we're still watching the tropics. But we've got about 8 weeks to get through,
Mhm.
8 to 10 weeks, and then after that, we're going to have much better conditions ahead. So everyone, hunker down, steel thyself, whatever you'd like to say about it, and then we'll be into fall and feeling a lot better, I think, about our weather. And until then, of course, we'll be watching things very closely on Space City Weather.
Very good. Thank you. So in about 8 weeks, we can take a big sigh of relief, and hopefully that sigh doesn't have too much humidity.
That's right.
Excellent. Well, Eric, thank you so much again for your time today. We truly appreciate it. And thank you for working with us to reschedule. Of course, we know you were so busy during the hurricane, but we appreciate your insights today and looking on to the rest of hurricane season. I do want to announce before we leave that next week we will be joined by Steve Sherman with the Kinder Institute at Rice University. So be sure to mark your calendars now and tune in. And again, Eric, thank you so much for your time today and sharing some valuable information. We truly appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, Christina. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, that is it for this Member Focus Monday. We will see you all next Monday at 9 a.m. Have a great week, everyone. Bye bye.